The storm had been dragging across the valley for 3 days straight, and by the time I guided my mule down the narrow track toward the outpost, the land no longer felt alive. Snow clung to the branches like brittle bones, the air so sharp it cut the inside of my throat with every breath. I had counted the losses that winter in silence. Each fence post snapped each calf that never saw spring, and the list weighed heavier than the packs on my animal's back. My name was Jonah Hale, and I had not ridden this far to barter for comforts. I had come to find something that might hold together the last scraps of my family's land. The trading post was little more than a crooked barn with smoke leaking from a rusted chimney. Its sign hung lopsided, one chain broken, clattering against the wood in the wind. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warmth was faint, just a weak fire gnawing on damp logs, but it was enough to sting my frozen cheeks. The man behind the counter, a broad-shouldered fellow, with a scar down his jaw, glanced up only long enough to grunt before returning to the knife he was using on a strip of leather. His name, I recalled, was Murphy, a trader whose reputation was built on the desperation of men who had nowhere else to go. I laid down a sack of dried beans and a bundle of pelts. "Need something that can pull?" I said, my voice rasping from the cold. "A horse mule, even an ox, if it can stand the winter." Murphy spat into the ashes and shook his head. "Stock's near gone. Storm took the rest. What I got left you wouldn't want unless you're eager to bury it by spring." He motioned with his chin toward the back pens. I followed, my boots crunching on a floor packed with years of dust and hay. The smell of animals and rot mixed in the air. Behind a row of rough stalls stood two horses' ribs showing through their coats' eyes, dull with exhaustion. One shifted uneasily when I stepped closer, but its legs trembled under its own weight. I felt that hollow ache again in my chest, the same one that came each time I realized the land and I were losing the same fight. I turned to leave. Then I noticed the last stall. It was not a horse that looked back at me. She was crouched, low arms wrapped around her knees, her dress torn into strips that hung like rags. An iron shackle circled her ankle chained to the post, though the lock was so rusted it looked ready to crumble. Her hair was tangled and hid most of her face, but when she shifted slightly, I caught the pale glimmer of eyes that were not empty, but carrying the weight of too many days spent in silence. Her lips parted as if the very act of speaking cost her more strength than she had. "Please," she whispered, and the sound barely reached me over the whine of the wind outside. "Take me instead. I can work. I will not run." For a moment I simply stared, the cold forgotten. I had seen cruelty before, men treating others as coin or livestock, but there was something about the way she did not cower, how she met my eyes, though her hands shook, that pierced deeper than the memory of any battlefield. Murphy cleared his throat behind me. "Not for sale," he muttered. "Some drifter left her here in trade. Said he'd be back, but it's been a week. Ain't my concern." The words were casual, as if she were no more than another broken mule tied up in the back. My fist tightened. I asked how much for the swayback out front and for her. Murphy narrowed his eyes. "What the hell would you want her for?" "Trouble's what she is. 20 for the nag and throw in your rifle if you're stubborn." I looked at the rifle slung across my back. The last heirloom of my father, carried through every hard season since. I felt its weight, then slowly unbuckled the strap and set it on the rail. Murphy grinned thinly and spat again before unlatching the chains. "She's yours. God help you." The girl did not move. She stared at my outstretched hand like it was a trick. Like if she reached for it, the world might collapse again. I did not push. I only said, "Jonah." Her lips trembled once before she answered, "Clara." The name felt fragile, as though it had not been spoken in a long time. When at last her fingers brushed mine, they were cold and trembling, but she stepped forward. Not as a possession, but as someone who wanted to believe stepping forward might mean something different this time. We left the trading post with the swayback tied to the sled and Clara seated beside me. The wind gnawed at us as we crossed the valley. She pulled her ragged coat tight, every muscle stiff, as if expecting a blow that never came. I kept my eyes on the path, letting silence carry us, because I knew words alone would not earn her trust. Still, I felt the weight of the choice pressed down on me, heavier than any winter storm. I had gone seeking an animal strong enough to save the ranch. Instead, I had brought back a human soul whose survival might demand more than strength. That night when we reached my cabin on the edge of the ridge, I lit the fire and showed her the small room, rough but clean. One cot by the wall, another blanket folded neatly on the spare bed I had kept since my brother passed. I motioned to it. "That one's yours." She looked at me as if she could not believe it. I stirred the pot of stew on the stove and poured her a bowl, setting it gently before her. She sat rigid, spoon clenched tight like a weapon, eyes flicking to me, then away. The silence stretched long, but I made no move toward her. Only when she finished did I add another log to the fire and speak at last. "No one owns you here." I said the words simple but steady. "No one touches what is not theirs." Clara's breath caught, and for the first time she looked at me not with terror, but with bewilderment, as if trying to decide whether to believe such a thing could be true. I did not press. I turned, lay down on my cot, and faced the wall. I heard her shift the creak of the spare bed springs as she sat, then finally lay down. For a long while she stayed awake, her breathing uneven until at last it steadied. The fire burned low, shadows moving across the log walls, and I closed my eyes knowing that whatever battle awaited in the morning, it would not be mine alone anymore. Dawn came pale and shivering, the kind of light that makes even sound seem fragile. I found Clara already awake, sitting on the edge of the spare bed, with her hands folded tight in her lap, as if she had been waiting for permission to breathe. The fire had settled to a red cradle of coals. I stirred it back to life and set the kettle on the small things you do when you do not yet know what larger thing could possibly be asked of you. I handed her a tin cup when the water steamed. She took it without looking at me, and the cup rattled softly against her teeth when she sipped. Outside, wind licked at the chinks in the cabin walls, and the roof gave a dry groan. I pulled on my boots and nodded toward the door. "Work makes a day make sense." I said, though what came out was only "help me with the wood." We stepped into the yard where the world was a quilt of crusted snow and old tracks. The woodpile leaned like a crooked tooth beside the shed. I showed her how I split logs along the grain, slow and even, not with brute force, but with patience, letting the wedge do the thinking. She watched my hands more than the axe, as if she were learning a language. When I passed her the kindling knife, she flinched, a brief flash through her shoulders, then steadied and knelt by the stump to shave curls as thin as pine straw. The shavings dropped in a soft spiral at her knees, and the smell of sap rose clean and sharp in the cold. We brought in armloads 2 by 2, stacking them beside the hearth. She worked until color climbed into her cheeks. When we finished, I ladled out yesterday's stew and broke a heel of bread into our bowls. She ate with the same careful intensity she had used with the knife, like each motion might be taken from her if she did it wrong. I did not speak, and that seemed to let the food heal. Something speech would only bruise. After breakfast, I took her to the small barn where my mule watched us with one tired ear forward. The sway back stood in the second stall, head low, hip bones like the corners of a broken table. We brushed their coats with stiff bristles, and I told her the names I had given them, only in my head. The mule was sorrel plain and true. The swayback I called Maggie because my mother had once sung a ballad by that name when she thought we could not hear a song about a woman who decided to live when it would have been easy not to. Clara tested the names under her breath, as if tasting them. It made the barn seem less like a place for surviving and more like a place for staying. Every task that day had a mirror. When I hauled water from the well, she learned the rhythm of the yoke across the shoulders and how not to spill it on the first step. When I patched a loose strap on the harness, she held the awl and watched the way I seated each stitch to keep it from tearing when the leather swelled with wet. When I swept the cabin floor, she circled back for the corners, as if the corners were where shame tried to take root. By sundown, the room did not look new, but it looked kept, and that difference made my lungs feel larger. I carried a small tin from the shelf and set it on the table. Inside were a few buttons, a length of thread, and 2 copper coins rubbed nearly smooth. I lifted one of the coins and turned it in the lamplight. My brother had kept them in his pocket until the heads were ghostly faces. He said they reminded him that even money forgets what it once was asked to prove. I told Clara none of that out loud. I only pushed the tin toward her and said, "If you need to mend anything, use what is in there." She looked from the tin to me and back, as if the gift were not the buttons, but the fact that there was a drawer in this world she could open without asking. That night the wind loosened and left us with a hush so large it felt like when a church goes silent after a hymn. I rolled a spare pair of wool socks into a neat bundle and placed them at the foot of her bed without ceremony. She did not touch them then, but later when she thought I slept, I heard the small, dry sound of fabric. I closed my eyes because some moments are not meant to be witnessed, only guarded. On the second morning, a thin band of blue edged the eastern hills. I took Clara up the narrow path behind the cabin to show her the boundary fence. Some rails leaned or had gone missing under the weight of the winter, but the posts still marked a line that said, "Here, not there." We walked it slow, my hand testing each post, her gaze keen on the places where the snow had drifted deep against the wire. At the far corner, a young cedar had grown crooked through the top strand. I set my boot against the wire and lifted, and she slid the twig free with careful fingers. She pressed the cedar sprig into the notch of the post and stepped back, satisfied with a small order restored. On the way down, we came to the stream that ran black and tight beneath a cover of ice. I showed her where the ice was thick and where it would not hold. She crouched and touched the surface with 2 fingers, as if greeting a skittish animal. The sun slipped out then, and for a breath the ice flashed like a mirror. She drew her hand back and tucked it into her sleeve. We heard the crows before we saw them, their calls carrying like rough laughter. 3 lifted from the big cottonwood beyond the pasture, and their wings clapped the air. Clara's eyes followed them until they were scrap shadows swallowed by the sky. "I do not like the sound they make," she said almost to herself. I said it is a kind of honesty. She nodded once, not because she agreed, but because she understood. I had meant no harm by saying it. We spent that afternoon mending the corral gate. I showed her the brace pattern, how a diagonal can make a weak square hold. She held the board while I set the nails, the hammer's rhythm steady and unhurried. Somewhere in the work, the air inside the space between us changed. It was not warmth exactly, but it was no longer ice. Perhaps it arrived when she asked without looking up, "How long since your brother?" I answered 2 winters now. I did not add the scent of rain that morning, or the way the yard was too quiet when we brought him in from the ridge. She did not ask for more. Her silence honored the parts I kept folded. As dusk leaned over the pasture, we took turns at the pump and washed our hands in water so cold it hurt. I caught her studying her palms, the raw places along the lifeline, the half-moons of dirt she had not yet scrubbed from the nail beds. I had known men who wanted a life without any mark of what it cost. They were always tired and never knew why. I said those will toughen, and then they will not crack so easy. She glanced at me and gave a small nod that felt like the beginning of a truce with her own body. Inside, while a pot of beans simmered with a scrap of pork, I laid a board across 2 blocks and brought out my brother's old whittling knife. The handle fit my hand the way a promise fits a mouth that means it. I cut a thin strip from a deadfall cedar and worked it down, slow curls falling like peelings from an apple. Clara sat near the fire with a shirt of mine across her knees, mending a torn cuff with the thread from the tin. The cabin held the kind of quiet that is not empty, but full of small sounds that trust one another. The knife whispering, the pot murmuring, the thread rasping through cloth, the log shifting its weight in the hearth. When we ate, she looked at me straight for the first time, not long and not daring, but without flinching. I said, "Tomorrow I will take the sled to the ridge for traps and fence wire. You can stay and tend the fire or come and learn the trail." She set down her spoon and thought a long while, like the choice itself was a muscle she had not used. Then she said, "I will come." The words were plain. Their weight was not. Later, as the fire sank to a gentle glow, I stepped outside to check the sky. Clouds had shredded, leaving a thin spill of stars, the kind that looked like salt scattered with a careful hand. On the way back in, I paused at the door and listened. Clara's breathing was even. I felt something in my chest ease that had been tight since the day I sold the good mare to pay the feed bill. Not joy, not yet, but a place where joy might someday sit without shaking the table. Before I slept, I set the small thing I had carved on the shelf near the hearth. It was not much, only a cedar token cut in the shape of a swallow mid-flight, wings curved as if catching a warm current. I did not leave a note. I did not say it was meant for her. I made no speech about what it might mean to me or to anyone. I simply placed it where a person could find it who needed to hold a piece of something, that knew how to move forward and still come home. Night folded over the cabin. The wind went soft as a mother's hush across the eaves. I lay down facing the wall the way I had the night before and closed my eyes. Sleep did not come at once. It never does on the first nights of a new life. But when it came, it was clean and without dream, and the last sound I knew was the slow crackle of a fire kept by two pairs of hands. The ridge trail was narrow, a thread of packed snow winding between pines that creaked with the weight of winter. Clara walked a few steps behind me, her breath making small clouds that disappeared almost as soon as they formed. She had wrapped her sleeves twice over her hands, and though her steps were careful, they did not falter. The sled dragged behind us with a dull scrape, carrying nothing yet, but space for whatever we might bring back. I pointed out the snare lines I had set weeks before. Most hung empty, the bait gone or the cord snapped where some fox had pulled free. At one line we found a rabbit stiff and glazed with frost, its body curled as though it had tried to sleep through its last moment. I showed her how to skin it cleanly, not for cruelty but for use, explaining which cuts to make, so the hide stayed whole. Her hands trembled, but she did not turn away. When we wrapped the meat in cloth, she carried it herself, her jaw set. Survival, I thought, had taught her harder things than this. We followed the ridge until the trees broke opening onto a clearing where the snow lay deep and untouched. The fence line cut through it, sagging under drifts. The rails bowed like tired shoulders. I handed Clara a hammer and a pouch of nails. She watched me fit one rail back into place, then mirrored the motion, her grip awkward at first. By the third nail, she struck true. By the fourth, the rhythm of metal on wood sounded almost like certainty. The sun climbed slow and pale. The air was sharp enough that each breath felt like drinking glass, but the work warmed us. When we stopped, I saw strands of hair stuck damp to her temples, and the faintest color had returned to her face. She caught me looking and quickly turned away, but not before I glimpsed something less guarded in her eyes. On the way back, we crossed the stream again. Ice had cracked along the edges where the current pressed. Clara crouched low, watching the water slide dark beneath a white crust. She placed a hand flat on the ice as though greeting a memory. I asked softly, "You could have run that night. Why did you not?" She did not answer at once. Her hand stayed against the ice until her skin burned with cold. Then she said there was nowhere to run to. The words were not bitter, only plain. I nodded and said nothing more. By the time we returned, dusk had begun to soften the treetops. Smoke rose from the chimney as the cabin welcomed us with its dry warmth. We set the rabbit stew to simmer and mended tack by lamplight. Clara sat near the fire with the cedar swallow I had carved her thumb, tracing its wings. She did not ask if it was meant for her. She did not have to. That night, as the wind thudded against the walls, I woke to the sound of her voice. It was not words, only a low murmur caught in the web of a dream. I rose and found her tangled in the quilt, breath sharp, face damp. I did not touch her. I only set another log on the fire and sat nearby until the nightmare eased. When she opened her eyes, she saw me there and stilled. Her hand crept slowly out from under the blanket, not reaching for mine, just resting on the edge of the bed like a question. I let my hand rest nearby, close enough that she could decide. After a long pause, she laid her fingers lightly across the back of mine. No more than that. But it was enough to say she knew I had stayed. The following morning, the world was white again, fresh snow wiping out every track we had made. Clara stood at the door, staring at the blankness as if it dared her to claim it. She looked back at me and said, "If I learned to ride, I could carry water from town." The thought surprised me. It was not a plea for permission, but an offering, a way of saying she wanted a place in the rhythm of this life. I smiled faintly, the closest I had come in months, and said, "We will start with Maggie. She is slow but steady." Clara nodded, and though her shoulders still carried the memory of chains, I saw them straighten just a little. Our first lesson was clumsy. Maggie shifted under the weight ears, flicking at Clara's unsure grip on the reins. I held the saddle horn steady, walking beside her as she sat stiff, her knees locked. She whispered to herself, not prayers but reminders. "I will not fall. I will not fall." After a short circle of the pasture, she slid down and laughed, a dry, cracked laugh that startled both of us. She covered her mouth quickly, but the sound had already spilled into the cold air. It was the first time I had heard joy from her lips, and it stayed with me long after the echo faded. That evening, while I mended a harness strap, Clara brought out the thread tin and set it between us. She had sewn her torn dress into something less ragged, the seams crooked but firm. She looked at me and said, "I want to make things last." Her words were simple, yet they carried more weight than any vow. I nodded, placing the strap beside her mended cloth, and for the first time the cabin felt less like a refuge against storms and more like a beginning. Spring came slow, as if it too had doubts about whether this land deserved another chance. The snow pulled back, in thin ribbons bearing patches of earth that smelled of damp roots and old stone. Clara walked with me to the far field, her boots sinking into the thaw. The ground was uneven, scattered with broken rails and the bones of last year's harvest, but when she looked at it, her eyes did not turn away. She asked, "What will you plant here?" I said, "Oats, if the soil still remembers how." She knelt, pressed her palm against the darkened earth, and whispered, "Then we will remind it." Our days fell into a rhythm that held us steady. Mornings at the corral, afternoons by the fence, evenings bent over work inside the cabin. Clara learned each task with the fierce concentration of someone who believed mistakes might cost her place. But slowly, as weeks turned, her hands grew sure. She did not ask if she was useful. She showed it by splitting logs until her shoulders ached, by hauling buckets without spilling, by keeping the fire alive even through nights when the wind howled like wolves. Once I found her mending my old coat, her stitches uneven but determined. She looked up almost defensive, but I only said thank you, and she relaxed into silence. Trust grew, not in grand moments, but in the smallest ones. When I came back late from checking traps, she had already set aside food by the hearth, warm beneath a cloth. When she fell asleep by the fire, I pulled the quilt over her without waking her. Once, while carrying water, she slipped on the ice and scraped her hand. I reached for it, expecting her to recoil, but she held it out steady, letting me wash the blood away. It was the first time she allowed touch without fear, and I treated it as carefully as if it were glass. Yet shadows did not leave easily. One night she stood by the window long after I had lain down, staring into the dark woods. I asked softly, "What do you see?" Her voice was flat. "Places I cannot go back to." I did not press further. We both knew silence sometimes holds more mercy than questions. As spring pressed harder against winter's grip, we began rebuilding the barn wall that had collapsed under the storm. I held the beam steady while she hammered, her hair falling loose into her face streaked with sawdust. She cursed under her breath when the nail bent, and I could not help but chuckle. She glanced at me sharply, then to my surprise let out a small laugh herself. It was brief, but it hung in the air like proof that she could. The horses sensed the change too. Sorrel lifted his head more often, ears twitching toward Clara's voice when she brought hay. Maggie, once so listless, began to nudge at her sleeve for treats. Clara spoke to them in a low hum, words I could not catch, but her tone carried a gentleness that even animals recognize. I realized then that she was not only learning to live again, she was teaching the place itself to breathe differently. One afternoon, after hours of lifting beams, we sat on the grass by the ridge, both of us damp with sweat despite the chill air. Clara pulled her knees to her chest and watched the clouds dragging slow across the sky. She said, "I used to wonder if there were places where no one knew my name, where I could start new." I told her every place can be new if you do not let the old follow you. She studied me for a long moment and asked, "Does it work for you?" I hesitated before answering. "Some days." Her gaze lingered as though weighing whether that was enough. Then she nodded as if to say it would have to be. That night I carved another figure from cedar. Not a swallow this time, but a small sprig of pine, the needles fanning out delicate. I placed it beside her mended dress while she slept. In the morning she picked it up without a word and tucked it into her pocket before beginning the chores. She never spoke of it, but sometimes when she thought I was not looking, her hand would rest there, as though holding on to more than wood. The first true test of our fragile peace came with a storm. Not the kind that shakes roofs and blinds roads, but a man-made storm riding on hooves and whiskey. Jedediah Stone stumbled into our yard one slate-gray morning, shouting Clara's name like a curse, his breath thick with drink. His voice cracked across the fence posts, and I felt Clara freeze inside the cabin, her gasp sharp as glass breaking. I stepped out before she could rifle in my hands, my voice low and steady. "You are not welcome here." He staggered closer, eyes wild knife glinting in his grip, spitting words about ownership and debt. I raised the barrel and told him, "Touch her and you bleed." His laugh was jagged, but it ended in a scream when my shot tore into his leg. He crumpled into the snow cursing until I dragged him to his horse, bound his wrists, and sent him toward town like the refuse he was. Before I turned away, I nailed a board to the gate with 3 words scratched in charcoal: "No one owns." When I came back, Clara was standing barefoot in the cold, her shoulders trembling but her eyes fixed on the road where Jedediah had gone. She did not speak. She did not have to. In that silence, I saw something shift inside her. Not relief, not yet, but the first breath of a life unchained. The yard was quiet after Jedediah was gone, but the silence was not the same as before. It carried a weight like the hush that follows thunder when the sky is still deciding whether to split again. Clara stood by the fence for a long while, her bare feet pressed into the frozen ground, her breath moving slow as though she was learning how to claim the air. I did not touch her. I simply waited until she turned and walked back inside the cabin, her shoulders drawn but her step steady. That night we ate in near silence. I could see her staring at the flames, her hands wrapped around the bowl, though the stew had already cooled. Finally she said, "Do you want to know what I thought that first night here?" I nodded once. She whispered, "I thought about running, even barefoot, even through the snow." Her laugh was dry and hollow. I did not believe men gave without taking. Not anymore. Not ever. Her voice broke a little, then steadied. "I even tried once before. There was a bridge not too high. I stood there for hours, but I did not jump, because I thought even death would not want me." Her words struck like iron to bone. I sat still, the chair creaking beneath me, and then I reached into my shirt. From the cord around my neck, I pulled a dark bullet flattened at its edge. I set it on the table between us. "This one came here," I said, tapping my side. "My brother Ethan shoved me behind a barrel and took the second. He died in the mud. We had promised to ride home together, or not at all." My voice felt scraped raw, but I forced the words out. "I stayed. Part of me did not want to." Clara's eyes stayed on the bullet. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said softly, "But you did stay." I answered yes. The silence that followed was dense, but not empty. When I opened my hand across the table, she hesitated, then slowly laid hers in mine. Our fingers did not tangle. They simply rested together, skin to skin, the warmth fragile but real. "You are not broken," I told her. My voice came rough as gravel but steady. "Even if you were, I would still want you here." Her breath caught and she blinked fast, not because of tears, but because her body did not yet know what to do with kindness that asked for nothing back. Her shoulders shifted, tilting toward me, not for protection, but because she chose it. I wrapped an arm gently around her, not a claim, not a chain-only presence. She let her head rest beneath my chin, and for the first time we sat that way until the fire died low. The days after passed with a different rhythm. She began to hum while working soft notes under her breath that sounded like songs she half remembered. When she swept the floor, she no longer rushed as though afraid someone would strike her for doing it wrong. Once while gathering kindling, she lifted her face to the sky and closed her eyes, the pale sun touching her cheeks. The sight made me stop mid-step because it was the first time I had seen her look like she belonged to herself. I began teaching her to ride more often. Maggie moved slow but sure, and Clara's posture softened with each lesson. By the end of 1 week, she circled the pasture without clutching the horn, her laughter carrying over the fence. I stood at the rail, watching my chest tight with something that was not sorrow, not exactly joy, but something alive. When I rode into town for supplies, she asked to come. I shook my head. "Let me bring you something back," I told her. "Not food or firewood, something else." She looked puzzled but said nothing. I returned at dusk with a bundle wrapped in flannel. We stood on the ridge behind the cabin as the sun dropped gold spilling across the pasture. I placed the bundle in her hands. She unfolded the cloth slowly. Inside lay a silver comb, simple and etched with wildflowers, worn but still gleaming. She stared at it as though it could not be real. "I saw it in the store," I said. "It is not new, but it is yours. No one paid for it with you." Her fingers shook as she lifted it, running at once through her hair, tucking a dark strand behind her ear. Her eyes glimmered. She whispered, "I have never belonged to anything good. Until now." I did not answer. I only stood with her as the sun slipped behind the mountains. We said nothing more because we did not need to. That night she set the comb on the mantel beside the cedar swallow and the pine sprig. Small tokens, all of them, but together they looked like proof of a different life, one that was being built quietly between the cracks of winter and spring. Spring settled fully across the valley, softening the earth until wildflowers pushed up through cracks in the pasture, like color spilled by accident. The cabin no longer smelled of smoke alone, but of bread rising slow in the oven, of leather newly oiled, of herbs drying on the windowsill. Laughter sometimes touched the walls, brief and shy at first, then lingering. It was not loud, but it carried the sound of life choosing to remain. One afternoon, Clara walked with me to the edge of the road where we traded eggs for flour. A traveling peddler squinted at her and said too loudly, "Ain't you the girl from last winter, the one chained up at the stock pens?" Clara froze, her body stiff, her eyes clouded by memory. Before she could answer, I spoke, my voice firm. "She was. Now she is my wife." The peddler blinked, muttered, and moved on. Clara turned to me, stunned, but I only kept tying the sacks of grain as if it were no more than truth spoken aloud. That night we stood beneath the tall cypress behind the barn. No preacher, no witnesses, only the wind moving through branches and the sky stretched with lavender light. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself from flour sacks, patched but clean. I had combed my hair back the closest I had come to ceremony. We faced each other and she whispered, "I have no vows." "Me neither," I said. "Only hands." We joined them, fingers firm and steady. The horses watched from the fence line. The sage carried its fragrance across the hill. When we kissed, it was gentle, shy, but without fear. Afterward, back in the cabin, Clara placed a folded letter on the hearth. "Read it when you want, or never," she said. Later, when she brushed her hair, I opened it. The words were uneven but clear. "You did not save me. You stood still. You built something kind and strong, and you let me step into it. You gave me space until I found myself worth saving. Now I choose you." I read it twice, then folded it and set it behind a stone on the mantel. From then on, the cabin was no longer only shelter, it was a home. Clara moved through it not as a guest, but as someone who had claimed its corners. She hung the silver comb on a nail by the bed. She planted herbs in a wooden box outside the window. She swept not because she feared punishment, but because she wanted the place clean for both of us. The rhythms of life shifted with the season. Mornings we rose to birdsong instead of silence. Clara fed the chickens while I fixed the fence. We worked side by side in the fields, our shadows long in the afternoon sun. Sometimes when she laughed at the stubbornness of a goat or the clumsiness of a calf, I found myself laughing too, the sound startling in my own ears. But the past did not vanish entirely. At times she woke in the night breath, short eyes wide until she saw me beside her, unmoving, steady. Then her body eased and she would lay her hand against my chest, counting the rhythm of my heart as though it were proof. Once she whispered, "I am still afraid." I answered, "So am I. But we are afraid here together." In early summer, we built a new corral. Clara's hammer struck true, her arms sure. When the last rail was set, she leaned against it, sweat on her brow, pride in her eyes. I handed her a canteen of water, and she drank deep, then poured the last drops over her head, laughing at the shock of cold. The sight carved itself into me, brighter than any battlefield memory, stronger than any winter storm. That evening, as dusk painted the hills in gold, Clara sat beside me on the ridge. She said, "I used to think I would never belong to anything but pain. Now I think I might belong to this land, to this home." Her voice broke softly. "To you." I took her hand, rough from work, warm from the day. No words were needed. The silence was vow enough. The summer light stretched long across the valley, spilling gold over the pasture until even the broken stones seemed to glow. The cabin walls, once weathered and bare, now carried signs of life, herbs hanging from the rafters. Tools neatly lined, a quilt folded at the foot of each bed. The land had not grown easier, but it had grown ours, stitched together by work and choice. Clara rose each morning before the sun fully cleared the ridge. Her hair tied back, her sleeves rolled. She moved through the chores with quiet steadiness, no longer flinching at every sound. I watched her once as she scattered grain for the chickens, her laughter carrying when one bold hen tried to snatch the scoop. It struck me then how different the sound was from that first dry laugh by the pasture. This was rounder, freer, a sound that belonged to her. I had thought healing would be a sudden thing, like rain breaking a drought. But it came slow, hidden inside the ordinary. In the way she left an extra log by the hearth when she knew I would return late. In the way I poured water for 2 cups without asking. In the way silence between us no longer pressed heavy, but settled gentle like a blanket across tired shoulders. One evening we sat on the ridge as the sun dropped, the sky awash in crimson and copper. Clara held the silver comb in her hand, turning it so the light caught the etching of wildflowers. She said softly, "I used to wonder if I was nothing but what had been done to me. Now I think I am what I choose to keep. I said you are more than both." She leaned against me, her head resting under my chin, and the truth of her weight there felt stronger than any words I could have spoken. When autumn came, the fields gave their first thin harvest. Oats small, but enough to fill the bins. We stacked the bales together side by side, and Clara brushed the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Her face was streaked with dirt, her smile wide and unashamed. I thought then that I had never seen anything more beautiful. On the night of the first frost, we built a fire higher than usual. Clara brought out the cedar swallow and the pine sprig I had carved, setting them on the mantel beside the letter she had written. She said these are reminders, not of where I came from, but of where I stayed. I looked at her and understood she no longer carried her past as chains, but as proof she had walked through and out the other side. That winter was harsh again, but not like the last. Storms came. Yet the cabin held firm, and so did we. When the wind battered the shutters, we tended the fire together. When illness passed through the valley, we shared what herbs we had with neighbors. Clara's hands no longer trembled when she reached for mine in the dark. Sometimes when I woke, I found her watching me, her gaze steady as if she were still reminding herself that I was real. By spring, wildflowers crept once more across the pasture. Clara planted rows of herbs by the cabin wall, their green shoots soft against the wood. One morning she pressed a sprig of lavender into my hand and said, "For peace." I kept it tucked in my coat pocket, the scent a quiet reminder every time I reached inside. Years later, when travelers passed by and asked whose place this was, I always answered the same ours. Not mine, not hers, but ours. They would see the cabin, the corral, the fields, and they would nod, never knowing the storms it had taken to build such a word. And sometimes when the evening settled and the fire burned low, Clara would sit with her head on my shoulder, her hand in mine. No vows spoken, no grand speeches. Only the steady truth we had built together, a life not born of rescue but of choice, a family forged from 2 people who stayed.